Jacksonville, Florida, located on the coast of the Atlantic and the banks of the mighty St. Johns River, Jacksonville has earned the title of the transportation gateway to Florida for over a century now. Between the city's maze of trackage made up of CSX, Norfolk Southern, and the Florida East Coast Railway, this is Florida's busiest rail town, hosting one of the largest ports in the state and non-stop 24/7 action. Amidst the chaos of several main lines, spur tracks, branch lines, and new construction, one subdivision stands out for its seclusion from cameras and rail enthusiasts. I'm talking about CSX's Kingsland Sub, a route like many in post-SEL Florida, made up of both Atlantic coastline and seaboard airline trackage, and probably the most interesting subdivision in the city. It's been the main artery for last-mile delivery in the city since its initial construction. Previously 3 different railroads, now combined into 2 Class 1s and 2 short lines that handle some of their Class 1 partners' dirty work. The Kingsland Sub and connecting routes weren't built overnight, instead, like many rail lines, having a rich history that began way back in the late 1800s. That's where we're going to start this one, in the early days of Jacksonville, Florida's original port city, that at one time maintained the busiest rail station in the world. It's 1860, and the city of Jacksonville's first rail presence is entering the city from the west, in the form of the Florida, Atlantic, and Gulf Central Railroad. The FA and GC would build a line stretching from Lake City to Jacksonville, which would be the stepping stone for industry and local commerce, as well as the city's large port construction that would turn the town from a local riverside village to an international trading post. By 1899, the Atlantic, Valdosta, and Western Railroad would enter the city from the north, soon taken over by the massive Southern Railway, currently Norfolk Southern. By the turn of the century, 2 more lines had been laid, one from Jessup via Folkestone and the St. Mary's River, and another from Newberry, close to Florida's west coast, to Milldale, a small but busy industrial neighborhood on Jacksonville's north side. Those 2 lines would eventually become Atlantic Coastline rails, with the original 1860 route soon to be controlled by the Seaboard Airline. Just a few years later, the attention of the public would be focused on Henry Flagler's Jacksonville Terminal project, one that 4 different railroads within the city would pour into to create a grand station in the center of town. While the station news for Jacksonville would be headlining papers, the SAL, ACL, and the Southern would all be fighting for business and trackage to and from the ports along the St. Johns, adjacent to the station project. Seaboard would score first, as they'd acquire the 1881-built Fernandina and Jacksonville Railroad main line, one that terminated in the middle of the port town after coming from Yulee and the junction with David Yulee's Florida Railroad. All trackage would eventually fall under Seaboard Airline, with the SAL building a connection track from Honeymoon to the port trackage at F&J Junction. Named F&J for the original Fernandina and Jacksonville line, Seaboard would cross both the Southern and the ACL at Duke's Crossing under the modern-day Beaver Street. With this connection track built, Seaboard now had access to their main line to Fernandina Beach, Yulee, and Savannah from their main route at Baldwin. The Southern and ACL knew that SAL was in a good spot, so both would get to work making their presence known on the east side of town. When the Atlantic, Valdosta, and Western Railroad was bought by the GS&F in 1902, a secondary route from Grand Junction to the port was just being completed, going under the radar and being incorporated as the St. Johns River Terminal Company. Even though the GS&F technically didn't own the St. Johns Terminal line, they were in a trackage right agreement with the company, which eventually became complete ownership as the Southern would take over both railroads. Atlantic Coastline finally got in on the action with a branch line stemming from Norwood along the old Jacksonville and Southwestern route, south to ports at Eastside, stretching all the way to the docks along the St. Johns. The SAL and ACL rivalry would be on full display in Jacksonville, as SAL would cement itself as the main carrier for industries north of the Trout River on the north side of town, but not without a battle with the ACL. In 1967, the once fiery competitors of the Atlantic Coastline and the Seaboard would merge to create the Seaboard Coastline. Since both railroads built so many routes right next door to each other, the single ownership of both companies now created plenty of secondary main lines and redundant trackage. So when the new railroad's massive consolidation project arrived in Jacksonville, the port lines were merged at junctions, creating the modern-day Kingsland Sub. This mix of ACL and SAL rails explains the confusing milepost system that this area has, as milepost prefixes will commonly switch between ASJ to S around corners or at junctions on the current CSX. It's easier to understand if you remember that anything with an A prefix will be ex-Atlantic Coastline, and anything with an S prefix will be ex-Seaboard. The St. John's Terminal Line, and later the Southern, is now all Norfolk Southern owned, as they have a couple of jobs that handle port traffic to Talleyrand and interchange traffic with the old Talleyrand shoreline, now renamed as the Jacksport Terminal Company, retitled in 2017 after Wabtec took over. The Kingsland Sub continues north from the Jacksport area up to Yulee, where it interchanges with the First Coast Railroad, an operation we'll go see later on, but for now, we'll start along the old ACL branch to see how two Class 1s and a short line operate in such close quarters amidst the still bustling Jacksport district. There are many main lines around Jacksonville that connect a plethora of industries, yards, and interchanges between railroads, the old Atlantic Coastline Main being one of the busiest. Built as the ACL's main yard for Jacksonville, CSX still maintains the freight yard, engine shops, and intermodal ramp, which are all served by many daily trains named Moncrief. On the north side of the yard is Control Point Moncrief, a signal that not only governs in and out of the yard, but also protects the at-grade diamond with Norfolk Southern, as they cross on their way to the port on that old St. John's terminal line. The signals here also serve the Y at Grand Junction and the entrance to the Kingsland Sub. As we covered, almost all Jacksonville terminal locals will originate and terminate out of Moncrief, making this signal the first one that trains will need to get onto the subdivision. With Jacksonville's Amtrak station in the background, you can see the switch that can take trains onto the Kingsland Sub via the south leg of Grand Junction's Y. In the evenings, a restricting signal is a common sight, as it guides Amtrak 98 into its Jacksonville station stop, as Norfolk Southern switches right behind the trees within Simpson Yard facilities.
Approach to the restricting south end track. Hey, approach restricted. Let's roll. '98 arriving, Jacksonville. Hey, arriving.
At milepost A640.0 and right around the corner from CP Moncrief is Grand Junction. Many times a day, you can hear dispatchers and trains alike calling signals here and getting track permission from here to points north on the Kingsland Sub. The rest of the Kingsland Sub from here on is dark territory, which means trains operating on this trackage need EC1 forms since there's no signals. We'll get more into the details of EC1s later on, but for now, think of it as the railroad's version of a permission slip that allows trains to use and operate on trackage between certain locations. Once the EC1 has been approved by the dispatcher, no other train can operate between the agreed upon limits, which is how, even without signals, trains stay out of each other's way and how two or more trains can operate simultaneously on the same line. On a cold and cloudy afternoon, local train L712 would have an EC1 or permission to come down from Milldale Yard to our east back to Moncrief via Grand Junction. A yellow approach signal would initially light up for L712, soon upgrading to an approach medium. Since L712 would be taking the north leg of the Y in order to pull by and back into Moncrief, this aspect gives 712 that headroom out on the main line to make his moves. Today's train would be made up of mostly tank cars from Sunoco at Milldale and the massive USG plant located along the St. John's. Just a mile and a half north of Grand Junction is the distance signal to the junction at Almeda Street. This signal is not only important because it warns trains of the approaching signal aspect at the absolute signal down the line, but also tells trains that they're about to enter signaled territory. Since this signal is not dispatcher controlled, that's what EC1 forms are for, and the reason we've moved up the line about 3 miles to Norwood. If you recall, Norwood is the spot where the Atlantic coastline branched off to the south with their spur track to the port and export yard. Nowadays, that spur is long gone, instead using SAL trackage to access the port via Milldale Junction. L712 passes by a favorite spot on the west side of Norwood, where a large oak tree and a few palm trees sandwich the tracks here as they descend from the hill at Grand Junction. Although it's now a jumble of businesses and a church, Norwood is still a name on the timetable, as it hosts the Norwood Yard Limits, which would be brought up in today's EC1 authority for L712. Looking west from town, the train would soon come into view as they prepare to enter the Simrise spur. L712 is a morning staple on this line, coming out of Moncrief usually around 0800 and using the subdivision to either head to Milldale or Eastport via F&J Yard. It would be a Friday on this occasion, so a morning at Simrise and an afternoon at Milldale is what would be in store for this crew as they back down the spur towards their first customer. Simrise has been a customer here for ages, as one can tell by the odd zoning of the industry. Located amidst miles of houses, neighborhoods, and residential living, this factory comes out of nowhere and is the only industry along the Grand Junction to Milldale stretch of the Kingsland Sub. It's a very busy place though, seeing train loads and empties out around 4 days a week. Simrise has been a Jacksonville company since 1910, well before anything was built around this other than the railroad, initially being a lone plot of land in the middle of the woods back here along the Moncrief Creek. The company develops, produces, and sells fragrance, a variety of flavorings, and even nutritious additives like vitamins after receiving tank cars loaded with crude sulfate turpentine via the railroad. The chemical sounds like a dangerous combination of many things, yet it's just a byproduct of the pulping process for making paper, making it a natural byproduct of wood that acts as a vital ingredient in soaps, perfumes, and cosmetics. Like most of CSX's customers around here, an employee from the plant is contacted to go over the day's switching moves with the conductor before unlocking the derail and letting the operation begin. Just over a half mile east on the line from Simrise is the subdivision's biggest junction, as 3 lines split from the main to Grand Junction and Moncrief. Back in the early 20th century, this entire area along the St. Johns and Trout River was called Milldale, annexed in 1932 as a company town built around the Cummer Lumber Company owned by Wellington Cummer at Sandfly Point. With the demise of the lumber industry around Jacksonville occurring just a few decades after the neighborhood's construction, Sandfly Point is now a grassy field between the two rivers, and Milldale is simply a name, once significant to many in the area. Looking west towards Moncrief, the track to the right is the main line, which continues over the Trout River to Bush, Eastport, and eventually Yulee, with the center track continuing to downtown Milldale, where USG houses its massive riverside gypsum plant. Finally, the track to the left is the export lead, branching off here and heading south towards the NS and Talleyrand interchange at F&J Yard. The power switch here is radio controlled, hence the light, always set for movement towards Bush and Eastport. When the signal is green, the switch is in its normal position, soon turning yellow as L758 would approach, coming off that export lead with a long string of cars from Export Yard down south on the line a few miles. Export isn't as busy as it used to be, now seeing a lot of storage traffic like this miscellaneous cut of cars, ranging from coal hoppers to tank cars to center beams and box cars, with intermodal wells bringing up the rear. South along the export lead that the L758 just came off of is the Evergreen Cemetery. Located just a mile or so south of Milldale Junction, the cemetery land was bought for $25 an acre in 1880. The Fernandina and Jacksonville Railroad, or F&J, actually hosted a depot here for visitor traffic, as the cemetery tragically filled up after the yellow fever epidemic of 1885. It's now on the National Register of Historic Places as of 2011 and is one of the most beautiful and peaceful spots along the Kingsland Sub. The original F&J still runs through the grounds via a grand tree tunnel, this morning framing a lone SD40-3 heading south towards Export Yard. Like many other rail lines in the state, the Kingsland Sub is over 100 years old. However, unlike many, it still today sees new construction along the line, like this brand new spur track just south of the cemetery at milepost S631.2. Retrofitted with another radio-controlled switch and signal, this spur extends all the way to Talleyrand docks via a rail overpass above Evergreen Avenue, ending up at Hollingsheed Cement, one of the largest industries around here, that's already served by Norfolk Southern. The two railroads have obviously come to an agreement on servicing for this place, as spurs like these are not cheap to build, so it's evident that CSX expects a handsome profit to come from this project and a new customer. Another couple of blocks south on the export lead is East 21st Street, where NS gets involved with its old St. John's Terminal line. The CSX and NS run parallel to each other here before combining about a mile to our south at F&J Yard, where interchange with the Talleyrand Railroad happens. This morning, the daily NS transfer job would be working the north end of F&J, spotting autorack and intermodal loads for the Talleyrand's morning job to pick up in just a couple of hours. Since this side of Jacksonville is documented so much less, there's always something to find or discover every time you come out here. Take the old trolley substation, for example, situated between the NS and CSX here at 21st Street. About a century ago, the Jacksonville Traction Company operated 60 miles of streetcar trackage throughout the city from 1911 to 1932. At one time, it would cross the St. John's Terminal and the F&J right here, with the old substation the only reminder of Florida's largest trolley system. Another artifact still standing here at F&J is this line side box, located along the CSX trackage. This box used to hold train registers, or paper forms that trains would need to fill out as they passed. This was once the north end of F&J yard limits, where trains would stop, open the box, put their information in, and continue past. The result is a line side train log that gets updated by the train crews themselves as they pass. Looking north from 21st Street, the NS heads north by east to their small Evergreen yard, where the second NS job will originate from, obtaining their traffic from that same transfer job at F&J Yard. Evergreen is where all port traffic for the NS is staged and switched, as two spurs break out from this line, one north to Talleyrand and the second a short spur to the propane industries along the St. John's. This morning, NS Jeep 60 number 7119 would be backing towards the port with a few tank cars for Centerpoint North, a propane dealer that sees loads in and empties out. Although large fences protect the industries from the occasional wanderer, the view from Talleyrand Avenue is still more than enough to see what NS does back here. Like all the other customers at the port, the security gate is opened after permission from an employee at the plant before NS backs into the spur. The other spur that branches out of Evergreen goes north to Talleyrand, where Keystone Properties and Hollingsheed Cement are switched. Hollingsheed is the customer that CSX built that new spur track to, served by two railroads now, and the company's very own switcher, number 2488. This industry has been rail served for years now, although tracks were ripped out around 2019 as the previous company filed for bankruptcy. The land only sat empty for a few months, however, as Hollingsheed would purchase the property and have the tracks rebuilt into the facility, now served by two Class 1 railroads. Back to the propane line, that NS switcher has completed their duties at the port and would return to Evergreen for the day, passing Buckman Street in the process. This is just one of two crossings on this spur and a nice spot to see NS come and go outside of port property. NS will usually switch Evergreen for the remainder of their shift before tying down deep in the yard, away from the public and the local vandals. Around the corner and you're back at 21st Street and F&J Yard, where stop signs guard the crossing of NS and CSX, as NS comes in from the west in their Simpson Yard, crossing the export lead while doing so. That NS line is the old St. John's Terminal, running over the CSX A line at CP Moncrief where we started out, and through the borough of Springfield, an up-and-coming suburb just north of downtown Jacksonville. Housing a line of local businesses, restaurants, clothing stores, and schools, Springfield is certainly the more developed part of town around here, and a good spot to grab a morning coffee and wait on NS, as the morning transfer out of Simpson Yard comes into town. At the old NSY is now a curve that takes the line across the CSX via those stop signs and into F&J Yard. Known as the Arts District, these last few blocks of Springfield are slated for gentrification by city officials in an attempt to revamp the old industrial park once known as Phoenix, now a handful of old factory buildings built along the old Southern. With the rising of the sun will come that NS transfer job, which, if long enough, will block the crossing here at North Liberty Street, as the train crew heeds the stop signs and then continues over the diamond after checking CSX's intersecting line. South from the Y is the south end of F&J Yard at milepost S632, where the transfer line from the Talleyrand, now the Jacksonville Terminal Company, joins the main line. While about half of F&J Yard has been abandoned on the west side of the crossing, the yard and interchange is still a very busy place, with NS delivering cars for the railroad every morning and CSX joining in a few days a week. Today, the Talleyrand would be shuffling around the cars that NS had brought in about 2 hours prior. Although the yard is quite long, the crew will still occasionally need a little bit of headroom onto CSX trackage. So a call to the CSX local at Export would be made in order to line the switch for the transfer track. Once all was agreed upon on both sides, the conductor steps out, lines the switch, and the Talleyrand has their few minutes of switching on the CSX all to themselves. After clearing up for the day, CSX would come by with their export yard switcher, needing extra headroom this day with a few cuts of cars that would be long enough to back up the engine all the way to F&J, almost a mile away from Export. Originally built for the Southern Pacific in September of 1975, engine 1583 is one of two MP15ACs that Watco uses on this line. It's a fun engine to chase around with its fitting hoard and exaggerated smokestack that billows anytime the engine has to put in the work to move around a long cut of cars. There are only a couple of public crossings on the Talleyrand line, as they run a short mile from F&J Yard to their portside yard, before trackage enters the port surrounded by gates, locks, and a heavy Port Authority security. At Buckman Street, one can set up on public property and watch as the former NS cut of cars backs its way into the yard here at the port with the little engine that could, pushing hard on the rear. At the east side of the yard, Talleyrand Avenue offers a good vantage of the engine track, yard, and railroad offices between two spurs that take the railroad into the port. This side of the yard is usually switched in the afternoons as the railroad prepares to take a loaded train back to the interchange at F&J. F&J, there's only a couple more miles of trackage on the export lead until the end of track at the Jaguar Stadium, starting with this curve just south of F&J Yard at Florida Avenue that swings trains off the old S line to the ACL, as milepost prefixes switch from the singular S to the ACL's ASJ identity. One more curve south is Export Yard and the old ACL's Port Yard, now hosting mostly stored cars and staging for customers south on the line around the stadium. Export used to be a daily operation down here, now only seeing trains about every other day. South of Export, the line dead ends in about a half mile after serving a couple of last customers on this old ACL spur. Stemming from the north end of Export is CSX's Scale Operations Center, which hosts a large rail scale used to weigh freight cars after repair, and a couple of rare scale test cars. These small flat cars are specifically built to hold very heavy metal weights and are used to calibrate the rail scale when needed. They'll usually sit just outside or within the scale shed, making for an interesting and old spur and one of a kind up here. Although usually backlit when operated, Export Yard's north end is a favorite shot for many photographers in the area, as Jacksonville's notable Matthews Bridge flies drivers over the St. Johns River on Florida Road 115. Even though it would be a complete shadow this day, it still makes for a uniquely Jacksonville shot as CSX train L758 works the yard. L758, as we'll soon see, is an everything local, going on duty at Moncrief and usually hopping on board their locomotives at Bush Yard or somewhere in the general JEA vicinity. Sometimes L758 will switch Blunt Island, sometimes it'll head to Moncrief, and sometimes it'll work Export, like on this occasion, as the crew grabs a cut of cars out of the storage line. With just a few hundred yards of trackage continuing south from Export Yard towards the stadium, this is the southernmost portion of the Kingsland Sub, and the least busy, although most weekdays something will be moving around here. Although it feels way down into town, Milldale Junction and the start of the export lead is still under 3 miles from here, as L712 with an ex-Conrail Jeep 40 trundles by, using that center track at Milldale to head into the small Milldale Yard, just around the corner at Buffalo Avenue. About a third of a mile from the junction is Milldale Yard, accessed by Buffalo Avenue and the original starting point of the ACL's line to Newberry on the west coast of Florida. This yard, located at the ASJ 645 milepost, is just a quarter mile or so from the St. Johns River, which flows just beyond the tree line on the east side. Milldale was that old lumber company town back in the day, now known as Panama Park to locals, hosting a compost company, a gas terminal, and United States Gypsum's humongous riverside plant. With the exception of the various tank cars here at Milldale, bound for gas terminals to the east, all traffic in and out of this line is on its way to or from USG. Around the corner is where downtown Milldale once stood, with the occasional old plantation-style house trackside along the line's final few feet to Sandfly Point and the location of the lumber mill that's no longer there. Crews on the afternoon switcher will usually stop to have lunch break at USG, as the operation here takes the majority of an afternoon, as 4 different spur tracks serve the plant, each one for a different carload. With old company-built houses still upright today, just 30 feet or so from the spurs here, USG is one of the most interesting areas in Jacksonville, as Ribbon Rail separates zoning from this billion-dollar corporation and low-income family household. North on the main line from Milldale is US 17, and the large crossing of the Kingsland Sub just south of Trout River. Facing the river, you can see the only absolute signal on this line north of Grand Junction, controlled by the bridge tender down at McGirt's Creek on the A-line. This 2-light signal guards the swing bridge over the Trout River, a calm waterway that stems from the St. Johns to our east and flows west towards downtown and north to Dinsmore. Located at milepost S629.0, many trains cross the river each day, one that separates the Moncrief and Bush sides of the subdivision, as Eastport yard limits begin just a few hundred feet north of the bridge. Just 2 blocks south of the crossing here at Trout River is Joseph's Pizza, one of the oldest establishments in the area, opened in 1956 and serving high-quality pies ever since. If you're photographing this line and need a quick snack or even a lunch, Joseph's is one of the best spots with its affordable pricing, quick and friendly service, and fantastic quality. Although a pedestrian walkway runs alongside the busy US 17 over Trout River, the best shot of the river is on the old pier, which once carried vehicle traffic over the water. Like many old bridges, the city opted to revamp the structure, fit for fishermen and the occasional photographer, in lieu of demolition. To the east are views of the St. John's and I-295's Doms Point Bridge sailing overhead, with ships passing by 24/7 underneath. Closer in along the Trout, boat traffic becomes less commercial as private sailboats and pleasure craft dot the calm waters. Wind is a large factor here as well, making sailboats popular for waterside residents and keeping the area cool. The aforementioned wind would be picking up, however, as train U796 comes into view and calls the signal here at Trout River as they cross the waterway and enter the yard limits at the S628.9. That's 15 miles per hour, looking out for any trains, equipment, or switches that may be in the way. As a conductor on this line says, we all work together via radio within the yard limits, but in concept, it's really just a free-for-all stretch of track.
The U796 through Trout River. Locomotive 458 northbound.
Starting their duties in Waycross's Rice Yard, this train runs nightly, 7 days a week, down the A line to Moncrief Yard, where they'll turn onto the Kingsland Sub at Grand Junction before arriving a bit later at Eastport Yard. Going on duty in the late evening, this train is usually a middle-of-the-night train that drops off all of its manifest traffic at Eastport well before sunrise. Although it's labeled as a local, this train looks like a manifest freight, one that's practically always a mile long or more, with a couple of 6-axle road locomotives on the head end. Every car on this train is destined for somewhere on the Kingsland Sub, hence its usual size and boxcar cuts that can be delivered anywhere between Imison, Bush, Craft, or up north at Yulee to the First Coast Railroad, which also serves the St. Mary's Railroad north of the state line. Just past Trout River on the line is the switch to Imison in what's considered Jacksonville's warehouse district. 1 to 2 locals are sent out every night to switch this maze of tracks, which serves close to a dozen different busy industries. Local L707 is the main switcher for this area, working the graveyard shift that will occasionally help the nightly L796 around Eastport and Bush Yard. Both operations are commonly seen working in unison well after midnight. Since the Kingsland Sub is dark territory, approach signals are needed on both sides of the Trout River to warn approaching trains of the absolute signals that guard the bridge over the water. Just a stone throw north of the switch to Imison is the southbound approach signal for the river, one that local L758 would be passing momentarily. 758 would start this morning in Bush and head to Moncrief, where the crew would pick up this sizable cut of intermodal for the Doms Point spur, an operation we'll take a look at in just a few more minutes.
758 to 796. 796. Yeah, 796, Bill 758 here northbound. I understand. Will do. 758 out.
For now, L758 would be entering those Eastport Yard limits that protect both Bush and Eastport Yards, hence his slowing to 15 miles an hour. Just a couple more miles and you'll reach Bush Yard, where CSX still maintains a busy yard office, which every afternoon rests in the shade of Anheuser-Busch's gigantic Jacksonville plant. This is milepost S626, where an AEI detector protects the south end of the yard to inventory any cars that roll in or out of the stub end yard. Down Bush Drive, about a block from the main crossing, is the entrance to the plant, one that's switched sometimes twice a day by yard jobs as they receive hoppers of malt barley, rice, and hops. The plant ships out over 240 semi-trucks of product a day, with operations beginning in 1969 and not taking a day off since. It's a 24/7 operation for both employees and the railroad, as local train L716 switches out the plant. With the exception of just a couple of Moncrief and Waycross-based trains, every single train on the Kingsland Sub starts its day here at Bush, where usually a handful of engines will sit overnight before crews board to begin their morning shortly after sunrise. Whenever L796 is late and arrives in daylight, the morning locals have to wait for the 796, which they call the big train, to drop its cars for them to deliver for the day. This results in one of the few times that Bush Yard will be close to, if not empty, as 796 passes by with dozens of cars that will soon be brought to Bush. From Bush, the main line crosses the Broward River before climbing onto the high ground where Seaboard built their mile-long Eastport yard. Weekdays in the mornings, it's a regularity to see trains L715 and L716 work together, as L715 brings cars from Bush to Eastport, while 716 builds its train for the day. South End Eastport is at what railroaders call the grass crossing, as the dirt path serves NutriTurf, owned by Anheuser-Busch. The farmland located north of Bush Yard and the plant is used to grow sod, watered by reclaimed runoff from the plant. Instead of dumping it into the nearby Broward River, the water is used here, as seen this morning, coating the circular grass farms. Looking south, L716 would be doubling out of Bush in order to put their train together for the Dom's Point Spur and Craft Yard, located just a couple of miles east of us on the spur track. Looking north is Eastport Yard and the motorized power switch that begins the Dom's Point Spur, which takes trains to Craft and Blunt Island. This area is likely the busiest on the subdivision, as locals will work Eastport and its handful of tracks for the majority of the day, sorting out cars from nearby customers and building locals that'll soon go on duty. Even with the usage of the ACL's Moncrief Yard to the west, Eastport and Bush still earned their keep north of the Trout River, serving mainline customers all the way up to Yulee and this subdivision's two main branches. With the switch to Imus to our south, the second spur breaks out of the south end of Eastport Yard as it bends to the east towards Dom Point. This is known as the Dom's Point Spur, a 5-mile line built by the Seaboard to serve North Jacksonville's heavy portside industrial neighborhoods and Jacksport's Blunt Island sea terminals. A morning customer on the Dom's Point line is L716, who'd be rounding the sharp curve from the main line at Eastport onto the spur, with a string of boxcars for Craft Yard about 2 miles to our east. Crossing Eastport here at the beginning of the spur, the track and the road intertwine here and there as both paths make their way east, with the next pull-off point being at the SO 626.7 milepost, where an industrial park spur branches north and where L716 rounds into the morning sun. The train is destined for Craft Yard, located at the SO 627 milepost, and where, coincidentally, Craft Road crosses over the west leg of the Craft Y. Craft Yard is the general staging yard for this spur, accessed by 2 legs that create a Y, which funnels trains into the yard. South of the yard is West Rock, a massive industry along the Broward River that handles dozens of boxcars daily, as they manufacture paperboard products for all over the country. Further east along the spur, the tracks cross Dunn Creek, just moments after passing under Interstate 295, Jacksonville's Beltway. This is one of 3 water crossings along the line to Blunt Island, accessed only by the adventurous photographer or dedicated fisherman. The waterway connects to the St. Johns just a mile downstream, making fishing good around here, and probably why so many trackside homes and docks exist along the water. eastward towards the end of the line and the spur towards Dom's Point, and ICTF branches south as the main continues past the old Jacksonville power plant. Shut down decades ago in favor of JEA's brand new Northside generating station, just a stone throw away south, the loop track is all that remains of the once coal receiving plant. Nowadays, JEA is all fly ash, with the railroad delivering empties and pulling loads almost every day of the week. Looking west from the crossing at New Berlin is Silatex Siding, where the branch to C&C bulk terminals and Jacksport's new intermodal facility breaks off the main. Heading down that way would be L758, with a string of intermodal for ICTF, crossing the bustling Zoo Parkway and rolling through some of this area's luscious marshlands. Just north of I-295's recognizable span over the St. Johns River is Jacksport and ICTF. Short for Intermodal Container Transfer Facility, ICTF sees a good bit of international traffic handled by daily locals like this L758, who has orders to drop and separate parts of their train into their own yard tracks for unloading. The massive trackside cranes will unload these containers onto trucks where they can be taken down the road to Blunt Island and Jacksport or across the country. At the end of the spur is Blunt Island, at the SO 631 milepost. Receiving mostly auto-rack traffic now, Blunt Island has a couple of different customers on it, all out of the public eye, as the entire island is secured by Jacksport Security and the U.S. military. On the east side is the island's command center, adjacent to a 3-track fully paved yard that handles military traffic. This can be anything from vehicles to tanks to loaded ammunition trains like this S-800, departing the island and crossing the long hump-shaped bridge over the St. Johns Strait. Trains like S-800 are some of the most interesting in the Jacksonville division, as they can carry all types of military equipment and be destined for anywhere in the country. They're also some of the coolest trains to chase, as the dark green and beige of the train make it one of the most unique sights in the state. Moving west 5 miles back over to Eastport and the beginning of the spur were set up as S-800 would round the sharp bend back onto the main line at Eastport and continue towards Trout River, Milldale Junction, and Moncrief Yard. The wind would once again be in full force as we'd leapfrog the train to Trout River, where the bridge would be lined and locked for S-800's passing. Although not as photogenic, the shortcut of empty flats is for crew safety, giving them a little extra space from their trainload of explosives in case the worst were to occur. These are called buffer cars, today in the shape of some empty flats, and the same setup for empty trains, like this S-822, also crossing the Trout River, now taking empties back to Blunt for loading onto ships elsewhere.
3, clear signal, Trout River, single main northbound 260, 73 out.
Back to Eastport, the Kingsland Sub continues north to the town of Yulee, where the main line once crossed Senator David Yulee's Florida Railroad running from Fernandina Beach to Cedar Key. The easternmost portion of that line still exists today, from here at Yulee to Amelia Island, now an 11-mile segment owned and operated by the First Coast Railroad Short Line. Yulee has a yard where interchange traffic is staged between the CSX and First Coast, as north from here, the Short Line owns trackage to the end of the line at Kingsland, where they interchange with the tiny St. Mary's Railroad, just across the Florida-Georgia border. Yulee is interesting for its green seaboard depot and much of its old infrastructure around the tracks, with mechanical boxes and sheds dating back to the line's seaboard days. On weekday mornings, one can stand next to the old depot and watch as CSX comes into town with local L715, a job out of Eastport to the First Coast. The crew will bring the cars into the yard, spot them in their respective drop-off tracks, and then assemble their train of southbounds to take back down to Eastport. Some mornings a First Coast crew is here waiting on them, other days they're at the beach, working the two largest customers on the line at Amelia Island. After crossing Kingsley Creek, which branches from the Nassau Sound on the Atlantic, the railroad will come into the island and bend north, serving the Railfanning Company next to the yard and West Rock on the north side of town. In the process, the line passes right through town along the Amelia River, which hosts boat traffic and some very good seafood, a business that many local restaurants count on. In downtown, the Seaboard's old Fernandina Depot still resides, beautifully restored as a welcome center and a museum. Looking east, the depot welcomes visitors into the quaint streets that serve coffee houses, antique stores, and busy boutiques, while the railroad utilizes two jobs every morning to switch the local industry just a half-mile away. Importing lumber from all over the state, the Railfanning Company turns these 40-foot-long pine trees into an assortment of paper products, which are loaded into boxcars and brought to the main line in CSX every morning. For a main line that was cut after mergers, consolidations, and misfortune, the Kingsland Sub is still one of Jacksonville's busiest routes, still serving a large and consistent customer base on the city's north side, all run by some of the nicest railroaders you'll ever meet. There's plenty more to see and cover around here, and I'll make sure to do just that in the upcoming productions. But for now, we'll let the Kingsland keep making its worth, and proving to city officials, environmentalists, and CSX just how important it really is. I really thank each and every one of you for watching this one. It took about 3 months to put all together between mapping, research, filming, editing, and finally publishing, but I think it was well worth it. Please reach out if you have any questions, comments, or concerns. I'll be happy to answer anything about the sub or ideas for future videos in the comment section below. But for now, until we meet again somewhere out there trackside, this is Christian from Multicolor Films. End of transmission.